Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser, the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Christian Fellowship, the peace of Jesus Christ to change our lives and the power of the Holy Spirit to change our world. We are continuing our brand new series about obedience in the presence of God, a study in the Old Testament law. This is for Drexel's summer term of 2024, and we're going to be looking at specific laws within the Old Testament, trying to see what they meant to the ancient Israelites and how they apply to us here and now. And we're going to look at the central verses within the Old Testament law, within the Torah, which quite often Jesus referred to as the greatest commandment, and looking at what is known as the Shema in Judaism, and the love your neighbor as yourself, which we see as well. But looking first at the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And that word Shema comes from the first word, hear or listen. This is, in many people's perspective, the central idea in all of the Torah and the Old Testament. Lord is one, Lord is our God, the Lord our God is one, and we should love God with all of who we are. And this verse breaks it down into heart, soul, and strength. But it's interestingly enough, we will quote that quite a bit, but look at the passage it's encased in, the verses before and after it. Deuteronomy 6, 1 through 9. These are the commands, decrees, and laws of the Lord your God. The Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and the commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy a long life. Hear, Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord your God, the God of your ancestors, promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Looking at this passage, we see that this central verse in the Torah is encased with this idea that you're supposed to communicate the law and supposed to teach others, specifically the next generation, specifically children, that law as well. And a measure of your faithfulness to God, a piece of that, a part of what it means to be faithful to God, is passing down the faith to someone else, to the next generation. How one passes God's instructions to the next generation reveals the essence of one's devotion to God. So, with this said, as we look through it, your faith is best put on display in how you communicate that faith to others, specifically the next generation and specifically your children. That is one of the measures of what it means to be faithful to God. There's this interesting idea in the Torah that for a foreigner to become one of the people of Israel, one of God's followers, it took 3 generations. It took the father being circumcised, the father's son, so his son would have to be circumcised, and then the grandson would need to be circumcised. And if all 3 generations got circumcised, that meant they could be included in the faithful to Yahweh, into the people of God, into the Israelites. And the idea there is that, okay, yes, I can make a decision. And as a father, I have some influence over the decision my son makes. And I can, at times, if the son is young enough, make a decision for my son. But if that son then passes that faith on to the grandson, that is, I have passed my faith on to my son, and my son has passed the faith on to the grandson. That is the measure of what it means to truly be faithful in Israel. And that is when you become someone who is, if you're a foreigner, that is how you become someone connected with Yahweh through the practices of Israel, is if not the individual, not even the individual son, but if the individual son grabs and catches the faith strong enough that that individual passes it on to the grandson, that's when a family moves from an outsider to an insider in the faith of Israel. And that is how you judge faithfulness, is on a generational level. Now, the next piece, and this might be the physically the central part of the Torah. Leviticus is the central book. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Chapter 19 is someplace in the middle of that, whether it's 18 or 19, but chapter 19 is kind of in a central place in the Torah. And chapter 19 starts with Leviticus 19:1 is, Lord said to Moses, speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy because I, the Lord, your God, am holy. And we see that this chapter 19, focuses on what does an individual have to do to consider themselves at least somewhat in line with the holiness of God. And in the chapter 19:18b, one of the ideas is love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And then later on in verses 33 and 34, it says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. And Jesus, when asked what is the greatest commandment, quotes the Shema, and then adds this verse, the 19:18b, onto the end of it. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no law greater than these two. And we see that in this passage of what does it mean to be holy like the Lord, treating your neighbor as loving your neighbor as yourself, and even loving the foreigner as yourself, is part of what it means to be holy like God is holy. Loving your neighbor and the immigrant is an important part of what it means to be holy like God is holy. So with all that said, there is no concept in the Old Testament of a private faith, of faithfulness that doesn't change how you act. Faithfulness to God was measured by how you passed your faith on to others and how you treated others, and your neighbor, and including the immigrant or foreigner in the land. So faithfulness was measured in ancient Israel by how you passed it on to the next generation, how you passed it on to your children, and how you loved your neighbor. Those were two of the key core concepts of what it meant to be faithful. And this makes sense. The idea of the law is, oh my, the God who just destroyed the Egyptian is living in our midst. What must I do? What must we do so that God doesn't react to us the same way God reacted to the Egyptians? How do we live obediently in the presence of God? So that is the question that the Old Testament law is trying to answer. And it's one thing for us to do that. We need to learn what that means and follow and obey that. But we also need, this is not just a one-time sort of thing. Each generation needs to wrestle with that question. So we need to pass the faith that we have found onto the next generation so that they can facilitate the answer to that question themselves. And it is not just my own thing, it is an us thing. We have to live in a way that we are treating each other in a way that God sees how we treat one another. We need to love our neighbor and to love the foreigner, the one trying to get close to God by joining the people of Israel as if they were ourselves. Thinking this through, some discussion questions. I would love to hear your answers on this. Based on the above criteria, passing the faith on or loving others, could you prove your faithfulness to God? Which one do you think you are stronger at and why? How could you improve passing your faith on to others? How could you improve loving others? So some practical hands-on sort of pieces to what it means to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So that's kind of the introduction, looking at what it means and what we're going to be unpacking as we study the law. We looked at the idea that God is with us. We looked at the idea that there is no separation between sacred and secular. And we looked at the idea that faithfulness is a very active sort of concept. We can't be faithful silently in our own heads, not expressing it to others and loving others along the way. That's the beginning of the journey. I hope you continue this journey with us for the next 7 lessons in what it means to be obedient in the presence of God and our study in the Old Testament law. As always, there are 3 ways to join in-person Sunday nights at 5, and then via Zoom on the following Monday night at 7 p.m. Then there's these weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and WordPress. I'm all over the social media, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow as appropriate on those social media things. Hopefully you enjoyed this first lesson in the series about the Old Testament law. I enjoyed having the conversation with you. Hopefully it continues real soon.